So that one thing blows up the whole economic foundation of socialism. Just that one essay. It's brilliant. And to this day, as far as I know, there isn't an answer from the other side that refutes Mises. They subvert it. They go around it and talk about, well, we're not really interested in efficiency. We're interested in equity. We're interested in fairness, right? Whereas you, capitalists, you're only worried about the amount of money you spend to build a car. We're only concerned about how many people can have cars.
Welcome back to another episode of Voices of Liberty, powered by Young Americans for Liberty. I'm your host, Sean Themea. We are live from Las Vegas at FreedomFest, the World's Fair of Liberty. And today, we're talking to someone who, dare I say, has written the definitive book on what liberty is, the history of the idea, and where we go from here. He took 10 years to study all of this, 4 years of focused writing, and the result is a book that's flying off the charts on Amazon that Dr. Ron Paul himself wrote the foreword to. He is from Chicago. He is living in Hawaii. He's someone I've had the pleasure of knowing for years now. Please welcome to the show, Mark Monoscalco. Mark, good to have you here.
Thank you, Sean. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm really happy to be associated with Young Americans for Liberty. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
And for those of you who might be interested, that's the cover, foreword by Dr. Ron Paul. That was quite a surprise for me. It was something that I didn't expect to have happen, but it's a much better book because Dr. Paul decided to write the foreword. I realized I have to really step it up, and it's a lot better in its final version than it would have been, I'm sure, without Dr. Paul's encouragement. So,
I'm glad he was such an inspiration for us both.
Yeah, really amazing.
So let's talk about that title, The Forbidden Idea.
The Forbidden Idea. So this is a real personal message that the forbidden idea is this: individual liberty founded in natural law that precedes government is fundamental for a rational human existence. Without individual liberty, we're merely slaves or beasts of burden. Carry that with you and remind yourself of that every time somebody wants to take something from you that belongs to you.
That's powerful and, dare I say, forbidden.
Forbidden.
to say such
That's
words.
right. That wasn't something you learned in social studies, I don't think. At least
certainly
I didn't.
not at a public school.
I didn't learn it, yeah.
So you open the book getting right into the meat of a question that I ask many guests on this show for their own personal answer, and I'm excited to ask you, given this context, what is individual liberty anyway? Yeah,
that's a very interesting experiment. I spent several years at FreedomFest just walking around asking that question to people that I have a lot of respect for, right? There's people at FreedomFest who have a lot more experience than I do and are a lot more knowledgeable than I am. And I was very surprised that everybody had a different answer, right? All the answers fit under, an overarching philosophy, but no one had just, X as the answer and then someone else repeated X. That didn't happen. I found that really disturbing. It's like, wow, the freedom movement, the liberty movement doesn't even have a consistent definition. So it wasn't that hidden, actually, to find. I dug around and working through early philosophy and our more recent philosophers, I came up with what I feel is a really concise and really defensible answer. The definition of individual liberty is the absence of coercion. Short, hard to misinterpret it, but I think that's sufficient.
So what does that look like on a micro level? Are we being, coerced in this very moment, for example? If so, how?
So I've got a really good definition of coercion, because that's, of course, necessary now that we're talking about it. Murray Rothbard gave a really good definition of coercion in The Ethics of Liberty. And it's something along the line of physical violence or the threat thereof against person or property. Justly acquired property. He qualified it. Justly acquired property. And I think that's sufficient. I don't think you have to make it more complicated than that. And I think everybody instantly recognizes that threat or actual physical violence, right? It's not something that's questionable. You'll know.
You also dive into, and you can advise, is this the way you lay out the book? Would you say that natural law, the non-aggression principle, positive negative rights, are those in a particular order, or
Yes.
could they be in any order? So you start then.
No, I did the philosophy. I'm very happy with how this turned out. And before I actually started writing this, I was concerned that I'm going to be duplicating something that somebody else has already done. I mean, I wasn't trying to rewrite the Ethics of Liberty or For a New Liberty or anything else. I wanted to be unique. And as far as I could tell, there isn't a really short and easy to understand philosophy of liberty explanation. So I've explained it in 40 pages, right? It's 6 chapters. I mean, it's really short, and I intentionally tried to make it really understandable for anybody. So it progresses in the way I laid it out from the definition, of course, and then we moved on through natural rights, the principle of self-ownership, non-aggression principle, and negative rights and positive rights. Negative rights and positive rights comes at the end. That's a little bit more undiscovered for most people. The people that have read the book and actually talked about it with me, a lot of them had never been exposed to that before. And even those that had heard it before didn't realize how fundamental that is. The negative rights portion, I think, is really the thing that most people are surprised at. That, their negative rights, it has that connotation because there's the word not in there. So your right to life is actually a negative right. You have a right not to be killed. Your right to liberty is a negative right. You have a right not to be aggressed upon or enslaved or threatened. And your right to property is a negative right also. You have a right not to have your property stolen. You have a right not to have your property trespassed. So the word not is where the negative connotation comes from. But the interesting thing that most people don't get is that for natural rights to be legitimate, to be natural rights, that has to be universal. That means everybody has that right. And it has to be exercisable simultaneously by everyone, right? There's no restrictions on the right to life. We all can have that at the same time, and we can all exercise it at the same time. There's no restrictions on the right to liberty, right to property. Anything else that people claim are rights, when you examine it, you realize that there's a selectivity in it, that only some people can exercise it at once. Right to health care. Someone else has to provide you with that health care, right? Not everybody can exercise that all at the same time. And then the person that's going to provide you with that health care may not be interested in providing you with the health care. Maybe you're not offering enough, or maybe you expect it for free. And in the person's world that's demanding the health care as though it's a right is going to use coercion or go get someone else to coerce someone to provide the healthcare. So if you get into a discussion, this is, I think, really powerful. If you get into a discussion and someone's claiming a right, and people dress these up really elegantly when they're trying to make a persuasive argument, so it sounds to the uninitiated, it sounds believable, or it sounds like it's an acceptable proposition. But it should be easy for you, once you really understand the difference between negative and positive rights, it should be easy for you to tell right away that this person's making a claim for a positive right. Positive rights could never be natural rights. It's a violation of individual liberty. And build your argument around that, your persuasive argument around that.
Yeah, back in debate club or debate team. I can't remember if we called it a club or a union or what have you in college, but we talked about this. They said, hey, the simple way, negative rights, freedom from, positive rights, freedom to. But we never got as deep into, positive rights by extension require coercion. And, if it can't apply to everybody, then it can't exist, in practice without, literal enslavement, right? I want to rewind a little bit to the first thing that came after coercion in your book in that order, which was natural law. So if you ask anybody on the street, hey, where do your rights come from, right? Many will say, from God, right? In the theory of natural law, natural rights, there's an answer provided of, hey, you as a human, you as an individual have rights, whether or not they come from God. Can you elaborate on natural law and where rights can come from, if not from God?
Yeah, so the original discussions of natural law go all the way back to Plato, and there was usually some superior being involved, right? That St. Thomas Aquinas was very big on explaining natural rights, and of course, in his opinion, it was from God, from your Creator. As time moved forward, more and more of the philosophers realized that wasn't necessary, and it might actually hold back the acceptance of the concept of natural law, because there's different beliefs about the supreme being, and there's different beliefs about the existence of a supreme being. And when we got to the most adamant 20th century philosophers, Ayn Rand, Murray Rothbard, they both based their natural law foundation on human reason. Now that goes all the way back to Aristotle. That was Aristotle's explanation, that it's the nature of man to know, and it's our abilities to reason that has promoted us above just a bestial existence, right? Without our ability to reason, we can't shape the world around us, and we would just be living at whatever nature provides, right? We'd be out there grubbing in the forest, or maybe fishing, or waiting for coconuts to fall. So human reason, or a supreme being, or a combination of both, are sufficient for natural rights. Either of those origins are sufficient.
And what was next in the order? If you understand coercion, you understand natural law, what came next?
Natural rights. We talk a little bit about natural rights because that's the what would you say, the result of natural law. There is one really, I want to add this about natural law. Frederick Bastiat's got a really cool quote. Sorry, Fred, I might get this wrong, but it goes something along the line of, man does not have life, liberty, and property because man had created laws. On the contrary, man created laws because he had life, liberty, and property in the first place. So that's a really important concept, that natural law predates government. And that should be obvious to anyone who has thought this through a little bit, but it's not common knowledge among our fellow citizens. There's this underlying distrust of humanity, that the only way human existence can survive is through law, through legislation, and coercion. Let's be honest with each other. That's the prevailing opinion, and that's wrong. It's backwards. So we moved from that. We moved into natural rights, which I'm fairly confident I can say that, in my opinion, we only have three: life, liberty, and property. And anything else that's a natural right is a subsidiary of one of those. If you follow the chain, it'll go back to life, liberty, or property. Whereas property is also one of the most powerful. I mean, of course, without your life, you have nothing. But without your property, you have nothing. Without the right private property, you're living in bestial existence. And we have to be more vocal in defending.
Yeah, because we've let
property.
the left, you and I, just society, right? The propaganda wars. The left has been able to make that seem like it's like, about greedy capitalism. It's about inequality and life isn't all about materialism. It's like, no, property in this context, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the fruits of your own labor. It's the right to build a station for yourself.
Yeah, without property rights, we really do descend into the Hobbesian world of a war of all against all. That is where it's going to descend to. The thing that I find most disturbing is that we hear an argument that property rights don't exist without government, because government, they have titles and they record the titles, and you have the police come if someone's trespassing on your property and all of that, right? So you have to wonder, wow, how did people survive before there was, property titles, right? Obviously, people were able, humans have been able to exist without the glove, the steel hand of government, beating someone on your behalf. So that, I think, is a red herring, and I don't think we should give that a lot of consideration. It has the ability to confuse people who are trying to make a persuasive argument, because it sounds legit, but it's not. Remember Bastiat. Remember what Bastiat told you, right? We made the laws because we already had property. That's why we made it. We already had the property. The property isn't yours because the government made the law. The property is yours because you homesteaded it, because you mixed your labor with it, because of your intellectual capacity, your ideas and your reason provided it to you. It doesn't come from the county. It doesn't come from the assessor's office, right? It comes from us.
Somehow, I don't think a clerk working in the assessor's office would do a great job at providing the right resources for my house, or I wouldn't trust on them to build my business for me. Right? That's why they're at the assessor's office. No offense, but non-aggression principle, right? The next core tenet,
yes.
Understanding the philosophy of liberty.
Non-aggression principle. It's the shortest part of the book, and it's the most important. It's the most important thing in the book, and it's very short because it's so simple and it's so logical. And I think I say something to the effect that if we would all adhere to the non-aggression principle, we would all live a peaceful and successful, prosperous life, right? One simple, and the non-aggression principle, Murray Rothbard has a really short and easy one. No man or group of men can aggress against person or property. And aggression, using his same definition of aggression before, violence or threat of violence. And your property is, it's an extension of yourself. So we have to have a bubble of protection around ourselves and our property. And of course, that includes our families, and it includes other people that you might want to add to that, so that the non-aggression principle does not exclude or prevent you from defending yourself. It just prevents you from committing violent acts against or threatening violence against others. But if someone's threatening violence against you, committing violence against you, your property, your family, your friends, or whoever else you consider part of your sphere of protection, then the non-aggression principle allows you to defend yourself.
And Matt Kibbe, in his own words, says, don't hurt people, don't take their stuff. Makes it very hard to disagree with that logic. But what's an example that people may say, well, no, in that case, of course we have to have some level of aggression, some level of violence, and maybe you'd counter-argue. What's an edge case of the non-aggression principle that comes to mind?
Well, we get that all the time in national defense, right? So right now, we're engaged in foreign conflicts that would be very difficult to explain how there was the threat of violence against U.S. citizens on U.S. territory, right? And people are going to make a really strong case for national defense, and there's intelligence estimates, and there's all these reasons why you have to be more careful now because we have nuclear weapons. But I think that in the big picture, it's hard to overturn the non-aggression principle, even on a national defense basis. You might have a very short window of decision-making if there's a report that there's incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles. Someone's got to make the decision to push the button and launch a retaliatory strike. But you would be, if it's justified, you would be responding to violence or an imminent threat of violence. You wouldn't be responding to, maybe we think this is going to happen, and if we do this now, they'll never be able to threaten us in the future. That go ahead and try to justify that, but I don't think you can ever make a real argument for that. Then people come up with all sorts of lifeboat situations, or the old trolley question where there's a trolley car going down the line and there's one person off to the side if you switch the trolley to the other track, but there's like four people in this, which those kind of questions I think don't have any bearing on a real philosophy of what we're talking about, right? Yes, you can concoct all kinds of situations, all kinds of thoughts, experiments that make the question more difficult, but it doesn't invalidate the underlying principle.
And to your earlier point, especially with very applicable scenarios that we need to attack them before they attack us, to your earlier point, if everyone abided by the non-aggression principle, there'd be no need for preemptive strikes if people were not aggressing on each other in the first place. So this is, some would say, you're casting a utopian vision, right? How might we make this realistic?
I'd like to say that Murray Rothbard told us that the true utopian is the one who gives all the guns and all of the ability to print the money and make the laws to a violent overlord, and then expects them to rule justly. That's the utopian. That's somebody who's thinking about something that'll never exist. On the other hand, someone who wants us to live under voluntary cooperation is trying to promote the natural tendency of mankind. That's our natural tendency, right? Yes, there's violent people. Yes, there's people who would prefer to take rather than produce. But there's way, way, way outweighed by the rest of society that has the understanding of cooperation and how much better their own life is in cooperation, right? We shouldn't be ashamed to espouse voluntary cooperation. I think people who are opposed to voluntary cooperation should be ashamed. They shouldn't speak in public without feeling uncomfortable.
If you're enjoying this episode, you can invest in the Voices of Liberty podcast at giveyal.org, donating to make future episodes bigger and better than ever before. That's giveyal.org. So you're saying the task at hand for those who love liberty is to flip the script. I'm not the radical. You're the radical. You want this monopoly of violence to have more control. You want, creation and innovation to slow. You want to plunder and thieve. It's not crazy to have less government. It's not crazy to have more freedom. It's you think a script narrative flipping is in order.
I think that's a brilliant way of describing it. I hadn't thought of flipping the script as a way, but that's perfect. Yes, we are too meek we get, I don't know, bullied is maybe not the right way of describing it, but by allowing the big government types to pretend somehow that they're the adults in the room and we're irresponsible is backwards. Just say no. That's what the government tells us, right? Just say no.
Yes. Nancy Reagan, what a gem. So not only have you gone through and laid out in those 40 pages a very concise, detailed philosophy of liberty, right, and understanding all the tenets that go under it, but you spend a good chunk of the book going into historical examples, not just of when liberty was fought for by the citizen, by the individual, but also how governments have restrained liberty and contracted liberty. And when most people think about the fight for liberty and these ideas, right, and also the great thinkers you cover throughout history. So for those who are steeped in liberty, right, Hayek, Mises, Nozick, these names of the last century or so come to mind. They're the freshest. Those who maybe aren't as steeped in the ideas will certainly think of the American Revolution, the Enlightenment. But you go into, and this was a great interest to me, you go into great detail about, pre-American Revolution, pre-Enlightenment, many examples of the struggle for liberty throughout history in many different civilizations and cultures. I'm curious, what are some of the more notable things that you learned when writing this book in civilizational history?
I had a really good time, I guess. I really enjoyed the research in the history section because there's so much that I didn't know. And I was surprised, I guess. I may have heard this, at one time or another. But there's a Bible story in Samuel about the Israelites demanding a king because everybody else had a king and they wanted to be protected and it was for their safety, and Samuel told them it's a bad idea, the king's going to take your property, he's going to conscript your sons, going to use your daughters, blah, blah, blah. It's this whole list of things that the king's going to do. And at the end, he tells them, when that day comes, you're going to beg for forgiveness. You're going to beg for help to remove this king, but you won't have any help coming, right? So don't make this bad decision. Another thing that I thought was really interesting is that you go way back, right? I think the very first thing I listed in the book is like 2300 BC in Mesopotamia, and one of the ancient rulers was trying to put limits on the powers that future kings could have, right? So way back then, and he has a whole list of things that were going wrong and how he was going to try to fix it. Later on in China, Taoism is one of the ancient philosophies. I guess some were bordering on religion. And one of the earliest writers in Taoism is Lao Tzu, who Murray Rothbard called the first libertarian. And he talks about how government is oppressive and regulations. And he says something to the effect that government, with its numerous regulations, more than the hairs of an ox, is more to be feared than fierce tigers. So there's a couple things about that I think that are really great, right? So all the way back in Mesopotamia, 2300 BC, you've got an example from a non-Western European culture, right? In China, non-Western European culture. Because another thing that is used against the liberty movement is that it's a product of the Enlightenment, which is a Western European and Western culture. And, you hear that it's just a bunch of old dead white men, right? You hear that story, right? Why should we listen to them, right? But it comes from all over the world. And it's powerful all over the world. One of the things in the history section that I found most fascinating, this is actually, I ran across it, Rothbard, I think, talks about it in For New Liberty, that in ancient Ireland, the ancient Gaelic civilization from approximately 500 BC to to 1500 AD were totally voluntary. It was the entire island was ruled by small groups that you today could probably consider tribes. They were called tuath. It was family members, neighbors, really small clusters, and they managed all of the affairs. They also had a common law system that was ruled by their judges were called brehons, and it was known as brehon law, but it was a common law system, and the brehons were chosen not by edict, not like it was picked by someone who was ruling, but they were chosen by the locals for their knowledge of the law, and also because of their experience and the results that they have produced. So if you had someone serving as a brehon who was coming up with results that people, both parties were upset about, he wasn't allowed to adjudicate in the future. He had to be effective. And, as we know, right, if you apply competition to anything, things get more efficient, right? And that's exactly what happened. And the other thing that I thought was fascinating about the tuaths is there was no restriction about leaving or joining. I mean, you had to be accepted. I don't know what the application process was, but you could leave a tuath and join another one, and that happened a lot, right? And sometimes tuaths would merge. But for all this time, it was an entire society, an entire country, voluntary, no central government. When the English finally tried to conquer Ireland, it took them over 100 years because there was no central government there. There was no central government for the English to co-opt and control the Irish. They had to go literally to every corner of the country and dominate the small local organizations. I think that's a fascinating story. And when your friends from the other side like to point out that we're speaking in utopian terms about voluntary cooperation, you could say, no, here's an example of one that lasted longer than the Roman Empire, right? Perfectly spontaneous order, and it was very, very effective. I'm really happy that I was able to include that, because that's something when I talk about it to most people, nobody's ever heard that, right? That one's not something you're going to get in your government school.
I certainly didn't learn about it in the classroom. And what I'm hearing, what I'm inferring, is that perhaps the secret ingredient to functional anarchy, to a new liberty, is potatoes.
Okay, so that one, sorry, you're going to be disappointed to learn this. Potatoes are not native to Europe. Potatoes are from South America. They come from Peru. There was no potatoes in Ireland until sometime in the 1500s. No potatoes.
Well,
sorry.
Scratch that, reverse it.
I'm sorry.
There must have been something else cooking in the water.
I'm sorry.
Speaking of no central government and yet achieving great things, sustaining, thriving, you made an interesting point about the American Revolution in that regard. Tell me more about what you're thinking there.
That's something that was really, for me, really important. We overlook, I think, the period between the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution being ratified. There was 14 years from the time of the First Continental Congress until the Constitution was ratified, where there was no federal government. No federal government. No president, no Senate, no federal judiciary, no standing army. And that ragtag bunch of 13 colonies, and then later they became states, under what was called the Articles of Confederation. They were able to form foreign alliances. They were able to engage in foreign trade. And using foreign alliances, they were able to defeat the most powerful army and navy on earth without a federal government. So if that's possible, if that was possible then, what is it now that's so critical that the federal government is irreplaceable, or at least in the current size that it is? What could we possibly construe to be so important that we've got to think about where we're at today? The largest, most powerful, and most indebted in human history government. How did it happen this way, right? It wasn't necessary to beat the British. And we can do better. I wanted to include economics, right? I'm very enthusiastic about Austrian economics. And initially I thought I'd include one chapter or maybe two chapters just about economics. And the more I was thinking about that, I say, nobody's going to read that, or they're going to start reading it and they're not going to finish it. And not being an author, I didn't really know what to expect. Then I realized, hey, wait a minute. In this history section, you can include anything you want. All you got to do is put a date in front of it, right? So I was able to mix in all the economics I wanted just by including a date and a reference to, usually it's about a book that someone wrote. So we got to include some of the really great figures. It's interesting that some of the giants in the liberty movement are economists. And like one of the tallest, as far as I'm concerned, is Ludwig von Mises. It's amazing what he was able to accomplish. And, he's worked to expand things that people had developed before him, but he also came up with things on his own, right? His whole concept of studying economics as studying human action, how humans interact, eliminates any economic discussion of collectives, because as far as he's concerned, economics is only about human action, only about individuals acting. And I think that's brilliant. And I include that at the beginning of the book when we talk about the definition of individual liberty, why we call it individual liberty, right? It's not just liberty, right? And as far as I'm concerned, when we're talking about it, we need to specifically say individual liberty because we're only interested in individuals. Ludwig von Mises told us that only the individual thinks, only the individual reasons, only the individual acts. There is no separate accounting for society, right? Murray Rothbard tells us that society is just an abstract concept. It's just only a collection of individuals. Society can only make decisions that the individuals have come to. Society can only move forward when the individuals produce something. So individual liberty is really important. And Mises is, I think, a genius to actually bring that to our attention. The other thing that I think he's just one of the great accomplishments, and relatively early in his career in the late 1920s, when socialism was the trendy, cool new thing, he wrote an essay called Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, and made an observation that if there's no private property, then there's no trading between people for private property, and there's no market for private property because there's no private property to be traded. There's no prices. So in a socialist society where the economy is being central planned, the central planners don't have access to prices for what Marx calls the means of production, but what we would call intermediate goods. So they don't have prices for rubber or plastic. So if they're producing a new product, how do they decide whether we should make it out of rubber or we should make it out of plastic? We don't know that, right? So at the end of the day, they can look and see how many cars they produced, how many apple pies, how many bed sheets, but they have no idea if any of them were produced efficiently. So that one thing blows up the whole economic foundation of socialism. Just that one essay. It's brilliant. And to this day, as far as I know, there isn't an answer from the other side that refutes Mises. they subvert it. They go around it and talk about, well, we're not really interested in efficiency. We're interested in equity. We're interested in fairness, right? Whereas you, capitalists, you're only worried about the amount of money you spend to build a car. We're only concerned about how many people can have cars, right? It's an out. They don't actually refute it. They just sneak around it without answering the question.
And ironically, by caring about that outcome, they can't achieve that outcome by virtue of how humans interact and, frankly, just how life works. To oversimplify it.
No,
so.
It's a system where you have warehouses full of rotting potatoes and people starving. It's eloquently put into disrepute by Mises. So I think he's really great. And I was able to include a lot of our really interesting Austrian economists and even some pre-Austrians. I'm excited about it, and I think our team needs to really have the basic economics when you're persuading others or when you're refuting others. It keeps you from slipping off into avenues of debate that are not productive. When you can really just crush the answer with the economic, the philosophy, it's so much cleaner, it's so much better. So study the economics.
I agree. Wise words.
Yeah.
One of my favorite parts from the history section, because as you know, right, Young Americans for Liberty were very focused on grassroots action and teaching students how to mobilize folks to control the political environment of legislators, of decision makers, right? And that the thing a politician fears most is demonstrable proof of angry voters because they might lose their job.
Right.
So that really jumped off the page for me when you explained how the Magna Carta came to be, right? When, this document that ultimately became the foundation for future documents like the Bill of Rights, Constitution, etc., as you described it, came to be because, well, King John lost a battle and folks around him pressured him to say, you need to release the rights of the English men, right? A declaration of rights of humans if you want to maintain your support and your power. And he said, fine, okay, I'll do it. And bing, bang, boom, there you go. Great piece of history from grassroots pressure.
It took a concerted effort by the nobles, and that was enough to sway, what would you say? The divine right suddenly had some sort of earthly control over it, right? It really apparently the king really isn't controlled just only by God, right? If there was enough of the people that are paying the bills that said, no, we need to change, he had to listen. That's a great step forward.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time here, and I want to make sure we talk about where we go from here. And, one of the points, I want to get this quote exactly right, so I wrote it down. You start to close the book with a line from, is it Camus? How do you pronounce it?
Albert Camus.
Camus. Albert Camus, which is the only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. I talk about forbidden ideas and forbidden ways of being.
Yeah.
So what does this mean to you, and how can people embody Camus's words?
This, just thinking about it makes me happy. It makes me feel as though there's a little bit you can do every day just to pour a little sand in the gears to stick your thumb in their eyes, so to speak. We do what you can to minimize the amount of taxes you pay. I'm not telling you to avoid paying taxes. I'm telling you to rearrange how your income is coming in, delay how you're accepting things. You've got control over that. Rearrange things in your life that would provide more freedom for others. Take your kids out of government schools tomorrow. That, by far, is the most effective thing you can do to stop the slide. The government school system is the what would I say, the most effective means that they have to propagate their message. And we didn't get a chance to talk about it in depth, but in the chapter right before my last chapter 8, there's 3 philosophies that all come together to put us where we are today. And one of them is called the takeover of the institutions. And intentionally, the socialists back in the 1920s started to infiltrate all the major institutions: education, government, religion, business, the media. And it's been more than 100 years. And look at the results you've got today, right? Look at how all of those institutions are corrupted. So anything we can do to not interact with it, or even better, build parallel institutions, right? I mean, right here, right? The podcasting has destroyed mainstream media. There's the small percentage of the population that still watches the network newses. Those people are getting older and older every day. It's dead, right? Podcasting has destroyed it. That's a powerful example of how we can build parallel institutions, but we can do that all the way up and down the board, right? You know, you don't have to homeschool your kid. You can do micro schools. You can do all sorts of other things that build parallel institutions to the government school systems, right? You can, if it really is something that's upsetting you, pull your kids out of your local church group. If you feel that the church group is preaching things that find a different one, right? Or study at home. There's so many little things that we can do that are going to make a huge difference if enough of us do it, right? The thing that we really have to do is believe in the Breitbart doctrine, that politics is downstream from culture. We have to persuade our friends and neighbors and business associates and co-workers of the primacy of individual liberty and of the philosophy of individual liberty and how we can actually make it work. But these people that you're going to be talking to, we call them little platoons, right? These are people that you know. They know you, they trust you, right? They'll listen to you. They might not understand it right away. They might not believe it right away, but they'll listen. And you're planting seeds of thought. And those seeds will sprout. When we get enough people in our little platoon, and they seem to be competent, encourage them to do the same. Build another little platoon, and these little platoons propagate. And as you guys know, if you get enough voters to start talking about one particular philosophy, there will be a politician who hears that. Hey, there's a lot of guys that think this is something that's important, and they're going to pick that up and start running on it because they want to get out ahead of it, right? They want to be the guy that picks up the votes. The thing that I think is most important that we have to encourage our little platoons is that the only way out of this situation we're in today is that we have to cut government spending. Massive, not just trimming. I'm talking about massive cuts in government spending at every level. Federal, state, and local. We've got a lot more control at the local level. If you show up at the park district meeting or your local city council meetings and you look around the room, the only people that show up are the people that want bigger government and more spending. We don't go, right? It's time for the forgotten man and woman to show up. And you don't have to get up and make, you don't have to make Thomas Paine speeches. You just have to get there and speak your mind. Other people hear that, right? And maybe some of your other little platoon will show up, so it'll be more than one of you, right? That's the low-hanging fruit. We have to cut government spending because, especially at the federal level, we're debasing the dollar at such an extraordinary rate. There's no way out. If we can't get it under control soon, and I mean by cut spending, I don't mean just reducing the amount of increase. I mean spend less this year than you spent last year. That's what cutting in government spending means, right? that's the only way out of this. If we're not able to get there, we're going to be in a very, very ugly situation.
Your notes on the platoons and inspiring folks to go in it together, it reminds me of the Sammy Adams quote, right? It doesn't take a majority to succeed, but a small irate minority set on setting brush fires in the minds of men. To paraphrase, that wasn't a perfect off-the-cuff rendition, but close to, it's like Guitar Hero. You get 90%, you still pass the level. Mark, where can people find and purchase a copy of The Forbidden Idea?
So The Forbidden Idea, my friends, it's available everywhere books are sold, but it's been most popular on Amazon. It's in every format, so hardcover, paperback, Kindle, and audiobook. I'm very hopeful that this will be something that'll inspire some of the people who read it. But even if you feel pretty comfortable with the philosophy and history and you don't think you need to read this book, you know many people who would benefit from this greatly. So when you're building your little platoon, give them the book as a stocking stuffer or for Valentine's Day. I'm sure there's so many women that would love to have this as a Valentine's Day gift. They would be so overwhelmed with joy. So
maybe even a Labor Day gift, just to be counterculture.
There you go.
Fight Marxism with freedom. Mark Monoscalco, thank you so much for joining us and being a voice of liberty.
Thanks, Sean. It's been great. Thank you for all the hard work you guys do. We appreciate it.
You bet.
Thanks for being with us today. If you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe to Voices of Liberty on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pandora, or YouTube. And to learn more about how you can be a part of the movement advancing freedom in our lifetime, visit yaliberty.org. I'm Sean Themea, and thank you for listening to Voices of Liberty, where we keep the torch of liberty burning by telling the stories of those who carry it forward. See you next time.